All right, so we are going to start talking about, and I'm re-recording this video because I didn't like the other one. We're going to talk about different types of collisions, okay? So we have really 4 different types of collisions. We have the enemy, or let's do the first one we'll do is the player on the enemy, okay? Then we have the enemy on the player, the enemy on the ground, and then we can have, there's a bunch of different types of ones, but basically it could be some type of collectible or it could be some type of weapon. So we could say collectible slash a weapon. So in ours that we have right now, we would end up having, our ninja. He would be able to throw some type of like shuriken, and hit the enemies. Okay, so we'd have to have that collision. Now, what do I mean by each of these? Well, a player on the enemy. When the player is heading towards the enemy, if the enemy hits the player, for most games, we want the player to lose some type of health component. And the enemy to die or also lose some type of health component. For infinite platform runners, most of the time, you're going to end up having the enemy probably go into some type of die state, but then health is removed from the player. So we need to give that type of feedback. We need to see that the enemies are dying and that they are getting hurt, which will be one type of collision that we need to set up. Then we need to using that same setup that we have, we need to take it so that the player, when the enemy hits, even though the enemy goes into a die state, we need to show that that health component goes down, which could be some type of HUD display, a heads-up display that is showing the health moving. But we could also have, the enemy get hit, get some type of force pushback. I want to develop it with a force pushback, but you could have the enemy blink a little bit, change colors, do something, maybe fade out a little bit, something to that effect to show that the player was hit by the enemy. And then we want to be able to have our player, and I said enemy on the ground. Really what we meant is, player on the ground because he's going to be dynamic. Now, if our enemies, either one of them, if we need to set up some type of situation where, say, our player is able to jump onto multiple platforms, we're going to have some type of setup so that we're not all just defaulting on one line, but that if we jump up, either we're jumping through our obstacle, or let's send this back, that our player can jump over it and then land on it, and maybe, if you guys want to put that feature in, I'm not going to do it, but where they could, duck down and dive through the platform again to go to the lower one. We need to develop that, which would mean that we would have to have some setup. That's why we'd have our foot sensor to be able to detect when we are on a platform. So if we're on this platform, that's where we want to be. We don't have any type of gravity. Now we could also do that with our enemies too, so that if our enemies end up falling off of some platform, they're walking towards our enemy, they will fall and go into some type of fall state. We could do that the same with the player too. He could fall down, and we could generate that he would die. Okay, so that is something that we want to do. So each one of these we're going to individually develop. Now, there is a couple things that we're going to have to make some changes for, and I'm going to display what this would look like. So here is where we are. So looking on the left, this is not being optimized. This is having issues. We kind of looked at some stuff. We had a die state. we need to fix this. What we don't want, and I don't know if you guys see it, but if you look, you'll see the enemies. It looks like they're not really going into the die state until after they get out of our radar. That's actually a problem. And what it is we are not really optimizing our code. I didn't even see it right at the start. So now if we look at the right, ignore that our player is doing like a little force push, but watch, as soon as we touch, so either our head or our body touches the enemy, as soon as that happens, the enemy is going into a die state, which is something that we want to see. Okay. So we're going to end up having to do some work to get to this point where we are not automatically checking over and over and over, and we're better optimizing pieces of our code. So there's a number of things that we're going to have to change from what we did in our 3.3. Okay, to get to this state. So now on the right, what do we see? We have, let me show this one. I'm going to stop this one on the left so you can see ultimately this is what we want to develop to. We have our enemy. Let's click on it. I got stars. I can go on the platforms and it's letting me know what platform I'm on based off of my foot sensor. We can throw stars. We can kill the enemies. Okay, now when an enemy hits us, see, it gives us a pushback. If the enemy is dead, we are not reacting. We did not do that on the other one. So even if we were killing the enemy or the enemy started dead, we were still reacting. So that's something that we have to make a change to. So we're going to go through and we're going to fix these pieces. Okay, so with that in mind, I just want to make sure that I'm working on this correct version. Enemy 1. Okay, even on this one I don't have that piece. So let me restart. Okay. So the first thing that I need to show that we have in this one, let me duplicate this because this is going to be our working copy. So we're duplicating our 3.3 and we're going to be building our 3.4. Now the focus that we're going to be doing on this one is going to be okay. One of the things that I did in between us setting that up is that reset position. So we're going to go look at that and make sure that we have that in there. Okay. So there's a number of places that we could do it, but what I have realized that there's a couple places that this starts becoming redundant. Let me just point out. So when we're looking at our player has, depending on the state, our player is resetting some type of position. See, we have our subject.position.y is, resetting that position. Okay. And so it's our player we have, when we're jumping and we're landing or we're doing a dive or we're in a run state, we have basically where we have to take a new position and we want to set that up. So we also need to do that for our enemies too. There are going to be cases where we need to reset our enemies. So to make that more transparent, we need to actually create a reset position. And we're going to do this in our dynamic state. Okay, so this dynamic class is going to end up having this reset. So this is what it is. So I have it up here. Make sure you guys write this. And then I'll talk about the places that you guys will put it. But this is what it is. So while I have it up, I'm going to just talk about it. Okay, so this reset position, we're taking an X and a Y. Now we'll check each one. We're going to check the X, we're going to check the Y. If the X is null, because we could set it as null, then we'll just take whatever the current position of whatever that creature or that object is. Okay, so I'm putting it on the dynamic instead. I had it on the player, but then realized that I wanted to move it so the enemies would also have access. And later on, I realized that I want to have it so I also have platforms and stuff like that. So we're just going to start and put it on the dynamic because we can actually reset positions of coins, collectibles, platforms that we want to jump on, enemies, everything is going to end up using this reset. Okay, so if we are not changing that X position, then we will just maintain the position that it already has. If we are not resetting the Y position, we will maintain the position that it already has. Otherwise, we are taking whatever coordinates that we are passing in, and that's what becomes the coordinates for that object. Okay, so this will become useful. After you do this reset position, the places that you're going to have to put it, anywhere that an enemy or a player right now needs to change a location, this is where you would have to use this reset position. So let's start at enemy 1. So we have a few states for enemy 1. I have a walk, an idle, and a die state. Now the die state, we'll have to, we have this, but we're going to have that set up so that we can see that accurately. There's a couple other areas of stuff that we're going to have to change, but let's look here. Okay, so the first place, when we are in the walk state, we are going to want to reset from what we originally had was that, when we are off the screen, that's what we're checking, then we're resetting and we're giving some positions. What I am doing is instead, when I'm in my enter state, I'm calling the dynamic reset position, that dynamic class, and I'm giving it its X, which is going to be the width of the canvas plus some random value, and then null for the Y, because I want it to stay. Now this is for my enemies. I want it to stay in whatever level I did. Okay, now we could maybe change this a little bit in the future, but this is what we're starting with. So we could have enemies that could randomly, get set on a higher platform, and we might change that, but it makes it more dynamic for us to be able to change it. So here in this enter state, we are calling that for the enemy 1 walk. Now if we scroll down here and we see, I do have in my update, instead of me going to the left of the canvas for my player before I do a reset, I am resetting while I still see him on the screen. This just makes it so it's a lot easier for me to see that it is dynamically changing. I can also have it where it is resetting to walking while it's still on the screen instead of off the, to the right of the screen. That way I can actively see that it's changing when it's supposed to be. Okay, so really only in that enter state do we have to do anything for that reset. Let's look at the idle. Again, it's the same thing. Okay, we are checking if we are off the screen. If we are, when we go into idle, then we are resetting the position. Okay, that's what it's going to be for enemy 1, enemy 2, and enemy 3 for the idle and the walk states. Okay, now if we go to our player, which is also going to be doing this, our player is going to have states. Let's look at his states. Okay, here, this die state, this would be a good example of putting that reset position in there. I'm only changing the Y, I'm not changing the X, so I should be putting that in there. But since I'm not playing around with the die state for the player yet, I'm going to leave it blank so I know that this is not fully working, because I do not want it to fully work yet. I want to stay in God mode. Okay, dive state, we are not changing our position when we're diving because we're continuing from the current position of a jump. Okay, idle, let's look there. This is one. We were changing our position for our Y to just the height minus the subject's radius. So we are using that reset position where we're passing a null for the X and then this is our change for our y. Okay, let's scroll down in our idle state to see if we have it anywhere else. We do not. Let's look at our jump state. When we are jumping, again, we are not resetting the position. We're jumping from a run state. In most cases, any other case, we're in a jump state and we're doing a higher jump. We are not changing our position. Okay, so we're just adding that jump strength and changing the animation. So I do not see a reset position on this. Okay, let's look at our run state. Our run state, when we enter into our run state, we are changing our reset position. In this case, we're changing not the X, but we are changing the height. Now we will probably make some changes under this when we start putting our platforms in, and that's okay. We just want to make sure that we're getting this right. Okay, so the reset position would go also for that run state. So that's basically it for that change. Let me mark this off. Okay. So we got that. Now, there are a couple things that we do need to look at. When we were watching this, we do end up having where our enemy, now let's watch that happen. So when we have our enemy hitting us, they are going into a death animation. We see that they're going into a die animation. So let's look at one of those enemies, because there is a mistake that we need to fix. Okay, so if we are in the die state for the enemy, we're changing the animation to die. We're changing the speed. We want them to basically stop moving, so it's only us. So we should see a change in speed from idle to walking. Okay. Now here, we just have it where it's getting reset. So in this case, I wasn't even seeing it. We have to double check. When we are going into a die state, we need to actually make sure that if we're finished with the animation, we need to stop looping it. And we wrote code in here, so I'm going to start at the top. Animation is one of them that we need to change. Let's scroll down here. Okay, so we have, this is finished right here. We have if is finished, I'm checking, and then we're checking if, we've already done the very last frame. If that's true, we're going to return it. Otherwise, we're going to return false. Okay, so this is something that we can check to see if the animation that we're doing is finished. Now, what we have not really set up is to make it so that we are paused on that animation. So in here, if I look at my update, we are updating our frame based off of this index that we have that we're adding this animation speed to. And then we're flooring it and making sure that it's only giving us values that are within the list or the length of frames of animations that we have. And then that's what we are using, that num frame, to draw our stuff. So if I'm looking at my display, see, we are displaying from the image list, we're displaying that num frame. Okay, so what we actually need to do in this update is this right here. This whole thing needs to actually only happen when we want it to loop, and then when we don't want it to loop, we actually want to pull the last frame, and that becomes our new num frame forever. Okay, so we need to add something inside of our constructor. Okay, and to have it continue to work exactly the same, as we start refactoring, we don't really want to majorly change our code that is working how we want it to, and just enhance. Okay, so in this case, I'm going to put this dot looping, and we're going to say is true. Okay, because we want it to loop until we tell it not to. Okay, now, if, and I'm going to put this stuff, this is what I want to loop. Okay, so if this dot looping is true, then we're going to do this stuff right here. So I'm just going to put that right in there. Okay, if it's not, that means we are not looping. Then I want this num frame to be that last frame, which would be, we're going to have to look for that last frame, that's this one right here, would be this dot image list dot length -1. That would be our very last frame, okay? Now, we won't really see it yet, but that firing extra is causing us issues. Now, what we can do is when we set it into a die state, we can actually make it so that the looping is shut off. So if we are looking at one of our enemies, and you will have to do this with all of the enemies, I'm not doing it with all of them. Okay. In here, this is the die state for my enemy. We set, when we first went in, to change the animation to die. Okay. Now, what we also want to do is, so we'll leave this go, because this is our movement. This is our reset. In between there, we want to actually check if our current animation is done. So, if this dot subject dot current animation dot is finished. Okay, that's what we already wrote. That's going to return true or false. Okay, so if that returns true, that means we finished it, then I want to set the looping for my animation to be false. So I don't care which animation, I'm just checking whatever the current animation is. Now in this case, we're in the die state. It is going to be the die animation. This dot subject dot current animation dot looping, and we could set that to false. Okay, so then this will have a fire, and then we should pause on that frame. But everything else should still look good. Okay, now it's resetting right away. Let's see if we change our reset to 0 so we can see it continue going off the screen to see if it's changing that frame. I'm only in enemy 1, so it's only going to work for enemy 1 right now. See, he died and he stayed that way. So enemy 1, he died. Now that kind of works a little bit weird because it's firing funny, which is the other thing that we need to do. So we have that piece. We're going to continue going on, okay, for the enemy collisions. Okay. When we exit the loop in our die state, okay, so this is the other thing. We're exiting out of our die state. What do we want to do? Well, we are changing the looping. So this dot subject dot current animation dot looping, we're setting that to true. Okay, we're resetting that back. There's another piece that we're going to end up having to put here, but I want us to fix something else before we need to do that to fix this firing. But that will set the looping back and forth from true to false. So we're just going to look at enemy 1. So ignore enemy 2 and enemy 3. Okay, so he did his animation, he fell down, he died, and he stayed dead. Okay, so that ultimately is working. All right, now the next thing that we need to do, because we've made that change in dynamic, we want to go down to our player, and we need to change some stuff. So we have this dynamics to check list, where we pass in all of the enemies in our game, and then we're only checking ones that are inside of our radar. That's what we're doing right here. We need to we need to fix this. There's actually an error in this that I didn't realize, okay, before we start trying to check our enemies here. And then we actually want to make changes to this, okay, so that we can use this right. All right. So in our build dynamics to check, okay, the issue that we have when we're looking at these enemies, okay, is that once we have a collision, we need to actually set them so that they are that dynamic versus dynamic that we put for originally all dynamic creatures. So this dynamic right here at the top, we had these flags set, dynamic versus map, dynamic versus dynamic, and friendly. Ultimately, these were flags that we can make it so we would be able to walk through walls if we wanted, be a ghost, be invincible or be invisible. That's what we ultimately need to play around with. And this is actually causing an issue because we are continually adding those people even after they're already in it. Okay, so all of this, so when we're in here, we're checking this enemy, but at no point are we checking if this is where we're wasting it right here, because we are pulling an enemy out of that list, checking if going through each sensor, checking if it collides with the radar, and then we're checking if this is included in the list already. Which, yes, it makes it so we're not adding it, but we're ultimately checking all this stuff multiple times. And so even though we end up removing it, it's getting added in like the next frame after. So we need to actually rearrange some of this stuff. We want to pull an enemy from the list, and then before we're doing this, before we're checking sensors, we're going to rewrite. So I'm going to comment out. Don't need that anymore. Let's just make sure that. Okay, I'm going to comment this out, and we're going to rewrite. So we're going to say if this dot dynamics to check dot includes enemy. So if it does not have it already, okay, that's what was down here. We're just front loading this. If it does not have it already, and the enemy is not friendly, okay, so we're looking for that friendly flag, and the dynamic versus dynamic for the enemy is still true. Dynamic versus dynamic. Dynamic. Okay. We want that to still be true. If all of that is true, then what do we want to do? Well, then we're going to look at the sensors. So for, let's just call them hitboxes, I guess, of each of those enemy sensors. Okay, we're going to do a for loop for that. Then we're going to be checking. Now, in this case, I'm willingly breaking this stuff before I fix it. I know. Okay. I actually want to change how I'm doing my collisions instead of me looking for specific types, like what I'm doing here. This is actually becoming, we've outgrown it. Now, we just need to return true or false, and then we can check what that type is. So we don't need to have it do that. So we're going to ultimately change that. So before we can run and test, we got to change something else. Okay, but I want to basically look at each one of the, say that the head, the body, and the sword of the enemy. If we collide with the radar, then I can check, hey, is it, in this case, as long as it's not the sword that we collided with, then we can push that onto the list for the distance within our radar. So we could say, the head or the body within the radar, then we can add it to the radar. At that point, though, I don't need to check if one of them, not both, if the head or the body is inside of the radar. I don't need to check the second one. Okay, I need to break out of it. And that's something that we did not do that is causing a little bit of an issue. So either one of these, it really doesn't matter. And in this case, I don't even really need to check if it's the body or the head. I just need one of them to be in there, because really all of it's doing is it's just trying to optimize. I could still even have it just check if the sword is in there. And that still would help. But we could say if hitbox.type is not, let's say, sword. Okay, you could do this. And this dot radar dot collided hitbox. Oops. So if we collided with the hitbox and it's not a sword, then what do we want to do? Well, we are this dot dynamics to check dot push and push that enemy. Okay, at that point, if that happens, if we are true on one of these, so right here, it doesn't matter which one we're checking. Okay, if that's true, we need to now break out of it. Okay, and this is where I had a logic error. Okay, it doesn't matter which one. I don't need to check the second one and also pass it. So in here, we're only getting in there if that person's not already added on the list. But once we're in here, we were checking multiple times. So we were still technically adding them, and then we had to pull them back off. So that was an error right here. Okay, so this fixed it. But hold on, I don't think I have a sword added on there. Let me add that for each one of the enemies real quick. All right, so I have the sword one added. Okay, so now let's look at the update dynamics to check. Okay, this is another error that we potentially have an issue with. If I am going forward in a loop, and I'm starting and I'm finding one and I'm skipping over it, my index numbers actually could become one off, and I might end up skipping something that should have been removed. And so they might linger for a little bit using the splice. Okay, now one of the ways that we can easily avoid this, because it's dynamically changing, the list is dynamically changing, is if I work on it from the back instead of from the front. I can remove, and it's not going to mess up the numbering for the index numbers of anything before it. Okay, and one way to do this is that I need to do a reverse loop. So I need to start at the back and work my way forward. Okay, so let's do this slowly. Let index equal this dot dynamics to check dot length -1. Okay, I'm starting at the end, and I'm going to keep going as long as index is greater than or equal to 0. As long as that is true, I'm okay. And then I'm going to decrement down. So I'm starting at the very last item on the list. I'm working my way down as long as we are at 0 or greater for my index. Okay, now my index, remember, is counting from the first item on my list to the last one. So we're counting from 0 all the way up to the length -1. So all I'm doing is I'm just looping backwards. So this all basically works exactly the same. except for that. So that was my reverse loop. Okay, let's go through. Before I do that last little piece, let's go to our sensors, because that's where we have another small error. Okay, so everything else is basically good in what we have for here, but we are going to make a change. Ultimately, this is going to get refactored, and we're going to need to be able to, instead of looking for different types, because I could find out those types easy enough, I just need to know if it's true or false. Right now, all we're doing is we're checking distances of circles. So I'm just going to make some changes. So instead of saying return object.type, if this is a collision, we're going to return true. Okay? And if it's not, we're going to return false. Okay, now let's go ahead and run. We should get an error, because we did not have it designed for this. It's not doing anything right now. Okay, so it didn't throw an error, but it is a logic error. Okay, so now let's go back. We made that little change. This is small. Now we need to go to our player update, and we need to fix that stuff. So scrolling back up to player. Okay, we did our update dynamics to check and our build dynamics to check. Let's look at our update. Okay, now this, we wanted both of these to check. Now this is something that there's a little bit of an order issue. We want to check our dynamic list. Okay, now at that point, before we start trying to do any type of collision stuff, there is, I'm going to update my FSM. So I'm going to move this. Instead of me doing that last, I want to do it first. Okay? Now, if I was in my walk state, run state, jump state, any of those states, and I dealt with some type of collision, at that point I could deal with an enemy from the list because it is up to date. Okay? If not, then I need to deal with my enemy here. However, the way that we had it written is not going to work like what we want. We want to be able to collide with an enemy. So basically what we want here, and all of this is going to need to end up changing. So regardless if you have this whole thing written or not, there's errors in it. Okay. So we want everything just to continue working. What we ultimately want when we do this is we need to do a reverse for loop going through the dynamics to check. Okay. We need to pull that entity off the list completely. Okay. Deal with that if it's a collision or not. If it is a collision, then we're not going to see it again. The reason why we kept seeing them until they were pulled out of that update dynamics to check is because we kept adding them back to the list multiple times as we were checking for the collision. So yep, it happened. We were resetting its die state 60 times a second. Okay, so we're going to make some changes to this, but we need to absolutely make sure that we are doing it from the back to front. So we can't do a for of loop. We need to actually do a for loop, but it's going to be reverse. So let index, let me stop this running so it doesn't keep freaking out. Index is equal to this dot dynamics to check dot length -1. And we want to keep going until index is no longer less than or equal to 0. Okay, as long as this is still true, we're good. And then we want to decrement down. All right, that is our starting loop. Now, we are going to use a local variable, we'll just call it dynamic. And that is going to be pulled from this dynamics to check list but we'll pop it from the end. Okay, push pushes onto the end, pop pulls from the end. There's shift and on shift if you needed to do it from the front, but we want to make sure that we're not messing up our numbers, so we're always going to pull from the end. Okay, now we pulled from the end, we can start checking. Okay, as long as dynamic is dynamic versus dynamic, if that's true. So dynamic versus dynamic. If that's true, and that dynamic that we're looking at, so this could be one of the enemies, is not friendly. Okay, so let's, not friendly. As long as those are both true, so it is an enemy and they are collidable, then we can start checking those sensors. So let's just do for sensor of the dynamic dot sensors. We're looking at that list. Okay. If and we want to know, so we're looking at specifically some type of collision against the enemy. This is just an enemy collision. If the sensor dot type, and we don't care if it's the sword because it's just the enemy's reaction to the player hitting it. So the sensor type, if that is equal to the head, or the sensor dot type is equal to the body, if either one of those are true, and so I'm going to have to write this. Let's put that in parentheses. This whole thing is going to be in parentheses. Okay, and if either one of the sensors that we're colliding with is a head or a body, and we are colliding with our head or our body, so we need to add this. So this dot head dot collided with that sensor, or this dot body dot collided with the sensor. And now remember, it's returning just true or false. So this is just going to, so when we're looking, it's not going to return if the sensor type is head or the sensor type is body. If either one of those is true, we're good, and we have collided with the head of our player or the body of our player, we are good. Okay, so if that is true, we got to write this out. Let me open up some space. Okay, if we have collided with an enemy, now I actually would need to know what type of enemy I have. Okay, do I have enemy 1? Do I have enemy 2? Do I have enemy 3? Okay, now if any of this is true though, right in here, it doesn't matter which one. We are looking through all the sensors and we're checking the head or the body. I want when I finish this if statement, I want to break out of this loop right here. Because if this is true, I'm breaking out of this loop. I don't need to check any more sensors for that enemy. I am resetting my state, and dynamic is done. So that means that once that loop is done, when we come back to this, we are looking at the next enemy. We're not looking at one that we already have dealt with. Okay, so right before this, we have to decide how are we going to deal with these enemies. Okay, so I can start checking. I can say, hey, if dynamic dot type is enemy 1, if that is true, then what do I want to do? Well, I'm going to, that needs to be 2 equals. I need to load a new state for that dynamic. So dynamic.fsm.push state new, and then this would be our E1, E2, E3 die states. So I got my E1 die state, and dynamic is the subject, and yes, it's poppable that we are killing our enemy. We're going to basically do the same thing for enemy 1, enemy 2, and enemy 3. So I'm just going to paste those. Enemy 2, enemy 3. This would be E3 and E2. Okay, now let's check to make sure that that's running, and we should see it react better for that collision. I'm going to go ahead and save before we start moving on. I have an error in logic. Okay. None of them are reacting. Okay, so let's check where we are. So we're going to want to start checking inside here. Let's see if we get inside of this. Okay, so console.log here. This would let me know if any of the dynamics are returning the dynamic versus dynamic, and if they're not friendly. It's not firing. Got some issue. Let's see if we're getting here. I'm not seeing it. Okay, so I want to know how many dynamics to check do we have. So I'm going to just log right here and see. We should start seeing some numbers change. Now I'm not going to run this very long because it's going to start freezing up my system. Zero. I should see the numbers go up for a little bit. I'm still seeing 0. Okay, so that means that my building dynamics to check is not working correctly. There's an error that I have somewhere in there.
Here's what I found. Here's what I found.
Go away, Siri. Enemies left. Okay, let's see if we get in here. So console.log. I don't have it, but I see why. I spelled dynamic wrong. I think that might work better. Okay, so now we're seeing still looks like they're reacting a little bit afterwards. So I think I still got a logic error in here. I'm going to pause this and I'll quickly find it, and then I'll come back. Okay. The error is when we are colliding. Okay, so we are building this list, we're updating. Now we made this change, so we're not doing this. Now, what we want to do is we're at this point right here. We have some collision. We know we have a collision either with the head or the body, with our head or our body of us. We're hitting the enemy. At that point, it doesn't matter what that dynamic is. That dynamic verse dynamic needs to change to false. Okay. In this case, because we are killing them off. Now, if we were doing something else, this would be where we are changing health, and then I might put the enemy update where we're checking if the health drops below a certain point, then we can have it change there. But since we're just giving our enemies just like a one hit to kill them, then this is sufficient. Okay, so let's go ahead and run that. We should see that should pull us so that they're not getting pulled into the list multiple times. There we go. See how it's happening sooner? That actually optimizes our list. Without that piece, and no, we're no longer colliding because it looks like we're not resetting that back. So we got to make sure that all of those are set back. So that dynamic verse dynamic needs to be set back to it when we get out of the die state. Now, I only did that for player 1, which is why we see enemy 2, enemy 3 getting back up. Player 1, it looks like we got a little bit of an error real quick. Let's go back up there. You guys are going to have to fix this for enemy 2 and enemy 3, but it's the same principle. We need to make sure that dynamic is shut off as soon as we have some type of collision, which will keep our updating dynamics to check and our building dynamics to check clean. Okay, now let's go to our enemy 1. When we are in our enemy 1 state. Now, I actually think instead of doing it there, since I know that I'm going to do a die state, I think it's actually better to put it here. Okay. And then when we are done and we come back out, we need to make it so we're dynamic again. So I'm going to do it here. This dot subject dot dynamic verse dynamic equals false. We are no longer colliding. And then when we are exiting out of the die state for the enemy, then we're setting it back to true again. Okay. All right, now I did that there. If I want to do this for my other enemy, false, and then this becomes true. This dot subject dot current animation dot looping equals or is true. That's right? Almost done, guys. Okay, those two pieces. And let's do enemy 3. Which, because I'm doing it here, and the reason why I'm doing it here is because I actually want this to be a part of the state instead of when I was doing it in the player, because even though I'm having that happen, this would be a lot harder to find where we don't want it to change, but we know that a die state has certain qualities. So I actually don't need it to fire like this. I'm going to have it fire as soon as we do it, and then I can specifically deal with that. Now I'm looking to see that they're dying correctly and that they're dying right as soon as they hit. Oh, one of them's getting back up. Now let's look at player 1. He dies. The other ones, they repeat. Why? Well, when we look at our enemy 1 animations, enemy 1 die state, what did we do? We have our update. We were checking if it was finished, and then we were resetting. So that right there needs to go for both of them. So in between here and in between here. And the update of every single one of our enemies. So let's see that. So here's enemy 2. He dies, he stays dead. They will all stay dead. Okay, that's what is supposed to happen. There is a little weird bounce, but that's actually not part of the animation. Or that's not so much a glitch, it's part of the animation. It looks weird. You'll see it differently if you change the speed. So we could go in here into the sketch and make some changes to it. But that's basically it. That is the first collision when we're looking at our player reacting with an enemy, and then what the enemy will do. Okay, so we see that change happening for the enemy. That is the first video that we're doing, and then the subsequent videos will have the other types of collisions. Okay, so make sure you guys have your code. It's properly working for this. Good luck. Have fun.